This is the story of the most colorful and controversial figure in American military history. A remarkable man whose exploits on the field of battle made him a legend in his own lifetime. George Armstrong Custer, the boy general, enjoyed a reputation for dash and daring unrivaled by his contemporaries. Yet more words have been written about his untimely end than of his many famous victories. Custer's extraordinary journey to immortality took him from a farm in New Rumley, Ohio, to the dusty banks of the Little Bighorn River, the place where he trusted his luck just once too often. Had Custer been born in the modern age of high technology and instant communication, he would undoubtedly have been a media star. He would have loved the TV cameras and the radio microphones, and they would have loved him. For Custer was the very embodiment of a dashing romantic hero, good-looking, confident, impetuous, and brave. His belief in himself and his abilities was absolute. He had little time for those who required him to justify his actions. He believed simply that his Army record spoke for itself. But Custer was also a complex man, and his path to the top of his profession was not completed without mishap or occasional brushes with authority. He undoubtedly possessed an enormous ego, ruthless ambition, and an unhealthy desire for self-aggrandizement. There is also little doubt that at times, and on one fateful occasion in particular, these personality traits affected his military judgment. But Custer was first and foremost a man who knew his own mind and his own ambitions, as he would later recall.
In years long numbered with the past, when I was verging upon manhood, my every thought was ambitious. Not to be wealthy, not to be learned, but to be great. I desired to link my name with acts and men in such a manner as to be a mark of honor, not only to the present, but to future generations.
George Armstrong Custer was born on December 5th, 1839, at New Rumley, Ohio. The son of Emanuel and Maria Custer, he was the oldest of 5 children. Contemporary accounts speak of a devoted and loving family. Nicknamed Auntie by his family, the young Custer was always attracted by the military life. From an early age, he attended drill meetings at the local militia with his father, who boasted that Custer was a born soldier. Custer also excelled at school. He was a leader in sports, by nature manly, exuberant, enthusiastic, and with a noble, knightly countenance, wrote one of his teachers, clearly impressed with the young man's ambition and excited by his potential. By the age of 16, Custer had but one desire: to enter the military academy at West Point and to train as an Army officer. After securing the nomination of a Republican congressman, he entered the famous academy in July 1857. However, Custer's passage through West Point was not a smooth one. He quickly gained a reputation as a practical joker and something of a mischief maker. One officer remarked wearily that if only Custer's academic grades matched his capacity for childish pranks, the cadet would already be a general. His classmates also noticed his highly developed appreciation of the charms of the opposite sex. Custer was, however, a voracious reader. He was enthralled by books such as Swallow Barn and Leatherstocking Tales, with their descriptions of Indian fighters and plainsmen in fringed buckskin shirts. The memory of these books never left Custer. In their pages lay his blueprint for the future. As Custer continued on his uncertain passage through West Point, the unhappy specter of civil war loomed over America. Up until then, open hostilities between the states had been unthinkable, even faintly ridiculous. As late as 1860, Jefferson Davis himself had said, "War between North and South? Inconceivable. 2 friendly nations, rather, living side by side." But by the spring of 1861, the differences between the two had become irreconcilable. Abraham Lincoln's electoral victory in November 1860 had prompted South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas to secede from the Union. The rift widened when, in February 1861, Jefferson Davis was appointed the first president of the Confederate States of America. The early months of that momentous year brought a very real and tangible tension to the entire country. With officers and cadets drawn from both North and South, West Point inevitably became a focus for these simmering tensions. Not surprisingly, differing loyalties saw relationships which had formerly been friendly quickly turn to animosity. April 1861 brought an end to the uncertainty. Confederate forces had fired upon the federal fort of Sumter in South Carolina, and the bloody nightmare of the Civil War had begun. For George Armstrong Custer, still studying at West Point, it was an emotional and unforgettable time. Not unnaturally for a young and patriotic fellow, he was itching to get into the war. A letter written to his beloved sister Anne in May 1861 illustrated his feelings.
My dear Anne, glad you are helping the good work by sewing clothes for soldiers. We study incessantly, and I and the others only average about 4 hours sleep in the 24. I work until 1 at night and get up at 5. All my classmates are becoming pale and thin. We do not complain. On the contrary, everyone is anxious and willing. It is my duty to take whatever position they assign me. It is useless to think the coming struggle will be bloodless or of short duration. Much blood will be spilled, and thousands of lives at the least lost. If it is to be my lot to fall in the service of my country and my country's rights, I will have no regrets.
With those students who favor the Confederacy gone home to the support of their homeland, West Point continued to supply officers for the U.S. Army throughout the Civil War. Owing to the unprecedented circumstances, training of cadets at West Point was shortened by 1 year. And so, in June 1861, having achieved 34th position in his class of 34, George Armstrong Custer graduated as a certified officer, a second lieutenant in the United States Army. Almost inevitably, Custer's new career did not get off to an auspicious start. He was arrested for failing to stop a fistfight between two young cadets. In fact, his cry of "Stand back, boys, let's have a fair fight," was clearly overheard by a superior officer, and Custer was charged with inciting a riot. The punishment for this misdemeanor was usually suspension or even expulsion from the Army, but Custer escaped with a reprimand. The fact was that the federal forces desperately needed Army officers for the war effort, however inexperienced. Perhaps this was the first instance of Custer's luck coming to his rescue. Custer was to place increasing reliance on this vital ingredient throughout his life. Now at last, Custer was about to fulfill his childhood's dream. His first taste of real battle was only a few days away. He was assigned to Company G, 2nd Cavalry, and sent to join the Northern Army at Centerville. The first major engagement of the American Civil War was to become known as the Battle of Bull Run. It was fought on Sunday, July 21st, 1861, in extraordinary, almost bizarre circumstances. On the morning of the battle, the very cream of high society from nearby Washington rode out to witness what they believed would be the only battle of the war. Their plan for the day was simple: a ride out in the sun, a picnic lunch, watch the federal forces deliver a crushing blow to the Southern rebels, and home in time for tea. However, things were not to turn out quite the way they had planned. By the end of the day, the men from the South had inflicted a stinging defeat upon the Federal Army, and the civilian onlookers were forced to join their dispirited soldiers in an undignified, shambolic retreat into Washington. During the bitter fighting, many fine federal military reputations were destroyed. However, some Northerners fought with distinction and undoubtedly advanced their career prospects. One such man was George Armstrong Custer. Cited for bravery in his very first battle, Custer's star was firmly in the ascendant. He now served in General McClellan's Army of the Potomac under Brigadier General Philip Kearny, known to his men as Fighting Phil. Custer watched closely the irascible, quick-tempered, but highly courageous Kearny, learning from his successes and noting his mistakes. Custer's next opportunity to shine came at the Battle of Williamsburg in May 1863, where he performed heroically, capturing 1 rebel captain, 5 men, and a battle flag. This outstanding achievement, plus an audacious daylight raid at Chickahominy River, won him an audience with General McClellan, the commander of the Federal forces. The general, whom Custer idolized, had been suitably impressed by Custer's exploits. As a result, barely 1 year after graduating from West Point, Custer was taken on to McClellan's staff. He was now Captain George A. Custer. However, the young man was not to last long in his new exalted position, for in the South, a remarkable commander had risen to revive the fortunes of the Confederacy. His name was Robert Edward Lee. A brilliant soldier and a humane man, Lee was to become a hero to his troops and a bête noire to the North. McClellan's failure to defeat Lee at Richmond in the spring of 1862, plus further bloody reverses at Second Bull Run and Antietam, prompted President Lincoln to relieve him of his command. Unfortunately for Custer, McClellan's fall from grace resulted in the loss of his own captaincy. He was now a mere lieutenant again. Custer felt the loss of McClellan terribly, and he was angry that the man he regarded so highly should have been treated so badly.
We have fought 3 battles, one of the greatest ever fought on this continent. General McClellan, after quietly submitting to the dastardly attacks of his enemies by his last campaign in Maryland, has put it beyond the power of the most lying to injure him. Enemies who, from lack of patriotism or from cowardice or both combined, have remained at home instead of coming forward to fight for our country. As for that newspaperman, whose name McClellan says he does not remember, if I ever met him, I would horsewhip him.
In the autumn of 1862, Custer found something, or rather someone, to distract him from the rigors of the war and his own stuttering career. He met and fell in love with Elizabeth Clift Bacon, the 21-year-old daughter of Judge Bacon of Monroe. Libby Bacon was certainly a beauty. Her delicate features, chestnut brown hair, and beautiful eyes made her the object of many a local boy's feverish desires. She was perhaps a little over-romantic and spoiled by her doting father, but it mattered not to Custer. The two began the quaint formalities of 19th century courtship. However, the romance was conducted without the approval of Libby's father, Judge Bacon, who remained unimpressed by Custer. At one point, he forbade Libby to write to Custer, who reacted typically by formally proposing marriage. Suitably flattered, Libby turned him down. Despite the uncertain progress of his great romance, life was sweet for Custer. His name had reached the ears of those in high places, and he was clearly marked down for rapid furtherment. In early June 1863, Custer played a prominent role in a battle which was to be a watershed in the fortunes of the North, at Brandy Station in Virginia. It was here that the Federal cavalry delivered a great blow to the Confederate horse commanded by Jeb Stuart. Until then, rebel horsemen were thought by both sides to be well nigh unbeatable. The dramatic events at Brandy Station proved otherwise. It was on June 25, 1863, that Custer received the letter he had dreamed of since his days at West Point. It was addressed to Brigadier General George A. Custer. What pride Custer must have felt as he held that letter in his hands. What joy at the fulfillment of his life's ambitions. He immediately wrote to his sister,
My dear Anne, you have heard of my good fortune. Promotion to Brigadier General. I have certainly great cause to rejoice. I am the youngest general in the United States Army by over 2 years. In itself, something to be proud of. I have been through many dangers since last I wrote you. I have been in many cavalry fights. I've had 3 horses shot from under me. One was Roanoke. I have had the post of honor ever since the Army crossed into Virginia. That is, I have held the advance with my division.
Brigadier General Custer was given command of the 1st, 5th, 6th, and 7th Michigan Cavalry, in addition to M Battery, 2nd U.S. Artillery, as he would later recall.
We'd been out probably 12 hours riding in the saddle, and I came into the officers' quarters. All the fellows were chiding me and slapping my back and congratulating me, saying, "Hello, General. Good evening, General." Thought to make a bit of fun of the fact that I boasted once too often that before the war would be over I'd be a general, and here I was, just a first lieutenant. Well, I'd gotten to the point where I was about to blow up and come to fisticuffs with a few of them. I wouldn't take it for them very long, and that's when George Yates stepped in and he said, "Hey, old fellow, wait a minute now. There on the table, that letter is addressed to you," and I picked it up, and there it said, "Addressed to Brevet Brigadier General George Armstrong Custer, ordering me to take command of the Michigan Cavalry Brigade." That was the only brigade at the time that was made up of men entirely from the state of Michigan. They composed the 1st, 5th, 6th, and 7th regiments. They were all volunteer men, and my orders were to join them at Hanover. Well, it was only several days later that I was in command of one of the finest fighting regiments or brigades in the entire Army of the Potomac. I led them from June 29th until October of '64.
Having reached the rank of general, Custer had no intention of hiding his light under a bushel. He took to wearing a velveteen coat with gold braid adorning its sleeves, and broad-collared shirts bearing his general star. This ostentatious outfit was complemented by a large, bright red necktie. News of Custer's promotion, however, was not received with universal joy. In the claustrophobic world of the United States Army, personal ambitions burned hotly, as did feelings of jealousy and resentment. One man in particular had been highly displeased by Custer's rapid rise. He was Brevet Major Marcus Reno, an honest, solid commander who unfortunately possessed none of Custer's dash or charisma. To Reno, who had graduated from West Point in 1857, Custer was little more than a foppish joke. But there he was, a proud brigadier general, while he, Reno, languished as a mere major. Although neither man could know it, fate had decreed that both men would enter history on the same fateful day, only a few years later. To add to his difficulties, the new general faced the almost undisguised skepticism of the men over whom he would command. After all, some of these troopers were many years his senior, and a good number were hard-bitten veterans. It would be a major achievement for Custer to win them over. The first battle in which Custer was to command as general had an overwhelming effect on the outcome of the American Civil War. It was on July 1st, 1863, that the first shots were fired at the small Pennsylvania market town of Gettysburg. The horrors of the bloody three-day battle which followed are etched indelibly into the annals of American military history.
George Armstrong Custer had been promoted to Brigadier General just a few days before this battle. He, of course, was a part of the Cavalry Division under Brigadier General Judson Kilpatrick. These troops had participated in a skirmish at Hanover, Pennsylvania, 13 miles east of here, on June 30th, one day before this battle started. There, Custer performed well, and that action forced Major General Stuart to take a longer route north, and as a result, Stuart did not get here till the evening of the second day. Then on the third day, Stuart was a part of the diversion taking place while Pickett's charge was underway. That action was met several miles east of here by two northern generals, Generals Gregg and General Custer. Custer, leading the Michigan Cavalry Brigade, performed well, and his action, together with the rest of the northern cavalrymen, prevented Stuart from interfering in the rear on the third day of the battle.
By the end of that third terrible day's fighting, Lee's attempted invasion of the North had been repulsed, and the South knew it could never hope to win the war by military force alone. Custer performed brilliantly during the savage fighting. On July 3rd, the final day of the engagement, Custer could sense the entire battle drifting the way of the Confederates. As he would later recall,
we'd gotten orders from General Kilpatrick to joined most of the forces up at Little Round Top. En route, I'd received a courier from General McMurray Gregg instructing me that he was having problems. Confederate horsemen were forming on Crest Ridge near Rummel's Barn, just east of Gettysburg by about 3 miles. I swung the brigade into line and ordered Alexander Pennington to take 2nd Artillery Company G and put them out in a skirmish formation. The 1st was a Sabre Regiment. They would be the first to draw blood when the enemy formed in position. Forming up in columns of 4, we cantered down the road until arriving. They were sure glad to see the colors of the Michigan Cavalry Brigade come over the ridge. At that point, they opened fire upon us. I instructed Pennington to return fire, and one of the luckiest shots in the war was when one of the shells went right into the enemy's muzzle of their cannon and knocked it from its carriage. I instructed my Wolverines to go into combat. Not so much ordering them to go, but come on men, follow me. The first battle charge was repulsed. We'd lost quite a few of them. That's when I threw the 5th and 6th out as skirmishers. They were armed with Spencer repeating rifles. They came on the forefront. Several fences were torn down and they opened fire on the enemy. This was the first time the Rebs had ever had a taste of the Spencer repeaters, because prior to that they were used to Sharps and Burnsides, and they were single shots. Well, that barrage of fire made believers out of them, because when they let off with the 2nd echelon to attack, they were repulsed quite quickly. That's when I brought the 7th up. The 7th was also a Sabre regiment. Knocking the 5th and 6th off the field, I led them forward with a charge. Come on, you Wolverines! And before long, Jeb Stuart's boys were hightailing it in the other direction. His hopes had been to turn the right flank of the Union forces atop Cemetery Ridge at the precise moment that Pickett was attacking the center. If he had been successful, Gettysburg would have been lost, and a Southern victory at that point in time in the war would have cost many casualties to the North. Quite possibly, that would have been the end of the war.
The blood-soaked fields of Gettysburg fell silent at dusk on July 3, 1863. General George E. Pickett's famous doomed charge had been repulsed, and its battered, bloodied survivors were struggling painfully down the slopes of Cemetery Hill. Jeb Stuart's brigades, smashed and utterly defeated, were retreating over Crest Ridge and back towards the Potomac River. The Union forces had won a great victory, and Custer had played a central part in the triumph. But almost as importantly, he had won the respect of the men of his command. From the skepticism and doubts of only a short time earlier, Custer had wrenched something which had seemed impossible: the admiration and veneration of his own troops. Indeed, Custer's dashing charge at Gettysburg soon passed into Army folklore, and the respect of the ordinary troopers actually turned into something approaching hero worship. Before long, every man in the 1st Michigan Cavalry was sporting the handsome, bright red necktie favored by their general. Custer unashamedly basked in his newly won celebrity. Magazines such as Harper's Weekly printed stylized pictures of the heroic general fearlessly charging enemy positions. In his hometown of Monroe, civic dignitaries clamored to invite him to their dinner tables and fought to be seen near him at official functions. For Custer, there was only one missing ingredient which would make life complete. He desperately wished to marry Libby Bacon. Libby herself was deeply in love with her man, but her domineering father had still to be won over. In October 1863, the young couple at last agreed to marry. But the hero who had faced enemy guns and swords with such conspicuous bravery could not pluck up the courage to ask Judge Bacon for his daughter's hand. In the end, it was Libby who announced their engagement to her father. It was not until November that Custer received the letter in which, rather reluctantly, Judge Bacon gave his consent to the marriage. Naturally, Custer was overjoyed. George Armstrong Custer and Elizabeth Bacon were married on February 9, 1864, in the First Presbyterian Church at Monroe. Libby looked radiant in her hooped, pale green wedding dress, her chestnut hair fashionably center-parted. She was every inch the beautiful, blushing bride. Her husband wore the full regulation dress of a brigadier general, and with his handsome good looks, they were indeed the perfect couple. Overnight, the Custers became the darlings of the newspapers, who portrayed them as a shining light of happiness in dark and testing times. After a short honeymoon in Vermont, the couple moved to Washington, where they hoped to further enjoy the trappings of celebrity. Unfortunately, their domestic bliss was cut short by Custer's recall to the front line. Refusing to stay alone in Washington, Libby followed her new husband to his quarters at Stevensburg, Virginia, braving the hardships of the war with him. It was on this Shenandoah campaign that Custer suffered one of his few reverses of his Civil War career, when he endured the indignity of having his baggage captured by the rebels. As he would later recall,
strange enough that I should still carry my toothbrush even after all these years. I recall that time during the Shenandoah campaign, back in the late rebellion. I'd had my baggage train captured, all my provisions, all my uniforms, in fact, and our love letters, Libby and my letters that we had written to one another. Many of them appeared at Richmond papers, and I'd wrote to her that they'd captured everything but my toothbrush. I still had my toothbrush. It was several months later, and we were pushing up through the Shenandoah, and I happened to capture Rosser's baggage trains. He had captured my baggage train, and then I captured all his uniforms and was walking around camp with all the cackling and laughter from the troops. And he said, "General, what'd you do, join the Rebs?" And I said, "No, this is Rosser's uniform." Rosser, who had been with me at West Point. You know, I'd sent him a nasty letter during the war. I said, "Tell your tailor to cut the tails a little shorter next time."
by the early months of 1865, the Confederate cause was all but lost. Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia had dwindled to only 28,000 fit fighting men. Beset by hunger and disease, February alone saw 3,000 Confederate soldiers desert, some making their way home, others giving themselves up to the Union side. On April 2nd, the Federals captured the vital town of Petersburg, and by the following day, the Confederate capital of Richmond was consumed by fire. Defeat was now only days away. The Confederate surrender came in a famous scene at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia on April 9, 1865. It was here that General Robert E. Lee and General Ulysses S. Grant signed the official ceasefire that finally brought 4 years of bitter fighting to an end. As he would later recall,
it was a great struggle, a great deal of strife, but always a contest. War, glorious war, pitting armies against armies, men moving in unison, one division against another division, corps against corps, clatter of weapons, the smell of cannon fire and gunshot, clouds of smoke that hung in the valley, and each time the thundering of horse beats on the ground, leading men that every word that I said, every command that I said, I had control of their very thoughts, but always responsibilities. Men's lives that would be lost. 618,000 men died from April of 61 to April of 65. That averaged out to 423 men dying for each day of the war. From Sunday to Saturday, 423 men died. To steel oneself for that kind of turmoil and that kind of bloodshed. I was in my early 20s, responsibilities of command, men's lives. Whatever decision that I made or did would cause men to die. Not an easy task. Those men that I knew as friends, companions at West Point, were firing at me from across lines. Through all that, the camaraderie, the memories, I can only say, war, glorious war. I love it.
Directly after the surrender, The commander of the Federal Cavalry Corps, General Philip Sheridan, presented Custer with the small oval-top table upon which the historic agreement had been written. Along with a gift, Sheridan sent a letter to Libby Custer. It read, "My dear Madam, I respectfully present you with the small writing table upon which the conditions of surrender of the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia were written by Lieutenant General Grant. And permit me to say, Madam, that there is scarcely an individual in our service who has contributed more to bring this about than your very gallant husband." The end of the Civil War saw the beginning of a very difficult time for Custer. For the man of action, life suddenly seemed terribly empty. There was little to interest him and nothing to look forward to. Furthermore, there were no longer articles about him in the newspapers, no mayors and judges, generals and majors praising his name to the heavens. For Custer and his massive ego, it seemed he was now a forgotten man. The onset of peace had brought another blow to Custer. The rank of Major General had been bestowed on him in the Union Volunteer Force. With the cessation of hostilities between the states, he reverted to his substantive rank of captain. It was all very difficult for Custer to accept. From general and war hero to mere captain in one fell swoop, what did the future hold for him and his faithful, loving wife? An expedition into Texas under his old commander Sheridan brought the restless Custer temporary relief from his concerns. Together, they sought out and did battle with Kirby Smith, the last Confederate general to stand firm and defy the U.S. government. For a few brief months, it must have seemed like old times for Custer. But of course, the work was short-term. Custer realized that all he could do was attempt to distinguish himself in battle yet again and hope for better things. Had he but known it, fate was conspiring to change his life forever. For in May 1866, he was offered the post of lieutenant colonel in the 7th Cavalry Regiment and told to prepare for a new type of warfare, the fight against the Plains Indians. Custer understood his new foe from the very first.
If I were an Indian, I often think that I would prefer to cast my lot amongst my people, those who adhere to the free open plains, rather than submit to the confines of a reservation, there to be the recipient of those blessed benefits thrown in without stint or measure.
Custer seized this welcome opportunity with his customary vim and vigor. He immediately smartened the appearance of the 7th Cavalry and adopted the new tune which would play the regiment into battle. This was the famous jig, Gary Owen, the tune that has become synonymous with Custer ever since. From the outside, Custer's new command soon began to look like a formidable fighting regiment. But appearances can be deceptive. Beneath the shiny facade of Custer's new 7th Cavalry lay a cauldron of seething discontent and burning resentment. Significantly, these feelings were held not only by the ordinary troopers of his command, but also by his fellow officers. Men such as Major Wycliffe Cooper, who possessed an impressive Army record but was a notorious drunk, found it impossible to accept Custer. With others, such as Captain Frederick Benteen, there was a plain clash of personality. He and Custer simply hated one another. To make matters worse, Custer had also become an extremely demanding commander. Rumors of his unrelenting treatment of men and officers during the Texas campaign had inevitably reached the 7th Cavalry, and this added to Custer's unpopularity in some quarters. It was not very long before the officers of the regiment had split into two distinct groups, those who were pro-Custer, such as Yates, Keogh, Hamilton, and Moylan, and those who were against, Benteen, Cooper, and Robert West. The situation would not be helped in later years when Custer's own brother Tom, who had a fine war record, joined the regiment, followed quickly by his brother-in-law, Lieutenant James Calhoun. All this helped the establishment of an unwelcome inner and outer circle of enemies and friends at the regiment's base, Fort Abraham Lincoln. Despite these domestic problems, Custer was confident of defeating the Indians nonetheless. Custer's military career had never run smoothly, and in July 1867, he found himself in more trouble. While patrolling the frontier with the 7th Cavalry, he absented himself without leave to visit Libby. In sharp contrast to this bending of the rules, he had only recently ordered the execution of 12 soldiers for desertion. the U.S. Army received the news of his amorous wanderings with considerable anger. Custer was court-martialed and suspended from duty without pay for 1 year. This was, of course, an enormous setback to his career. Now, what would happen to the 7th Cavalry? Who would join Sheridan to fight the Indian Wars? But however much Custer fretted, there was little to be done. He and Libby returned, chastened, to the tranquility of Monroe, where Custer decided to concentrate on writing his memoirs. There he would wait, but he would return. And return he certainly did, sooner than he hoped, for with only 10 months of his suspension served, Custer received a letter from General Sheridan, which read, "General Sherman, Sully, and myself, and nearly all the officers of your regiment, have asked for you, and I hope the application will be successful. Can you come at once? 11 companies of your regiment will move about October 1st against the hostile Indians from Medicine Lodge Creek towards the Wichita Mountains." The ecstatic Custer joined Sheridan at once. How good it felt to return.
Today I breakfasted with General Sheridan and his staff. He said, "Custer, I rely on you in everything, and shall send you on this expedition without orders, leaving you to act entirely on your own judgment. Some of the officers think this may be a campaign on paper, but I know General Sheridan better. We are going to the heart of the Indian country, where white troops have never been before." Yesterday, my 12 Osage scouts joined me, a splendid set of warriors headed by a chief, Little Beaver. They are painted and dressed for warpath and well armed with Springfield breech-loading guns. All are superb horsemen. A white woman has come into our camp, 4 days without food. I suppose her to be captured by the Indians and rendered insane by her barbarous treatment. I sent her tonight, by the mail party, to Fort Dodge.
Custer returned to the 7th Cavalry to find a deeply demoralized regiment, badly depleted in number and a mere shadow of its former self. Undaunted, Custer determined to make it once more into a first-class fighting unit. He initiated a series of back-breaking, intensive training exercises designed to whip the 7th back into shape. Naturally, his reinstatement meant the renewal of old tensions and rivalries within the officers of the regiment. And now another old enemy had arrived to bolster the ranks of the anti-Custer faction. Major Marcus Reno, still embittered, had joined the 7th. During the next few years, Custer attempted to deal with the Indian problem in an utterly ruthless manner. Vicious dawn raids on Indian villages, women and children held prisoner, teepees burned, pony herds slaughtered. All were commonplace tactics as Custer attempted to further his regiment's and his own reputation.
The government has given me reports that possibility of 1,500 Indians in the field. The 7th Cavalry makes up one part of a three-pronged movement moving into the territories, and our hopes are to return the Indians to the reservations. Those who are off the reservations by order of our government have been deemed hostile. Those who were supposed to be on the reservations as of January 31st and have not complied will be dealt with by the military. Possibly 2,500 troops will be in the field this summer, and there should not be any problems for us to bring in.
These heartless tactics earned him the hatred of the Indian tribes, who had nicknamed Custer Yellowhair. Their chiefs, such as Crazy Horse, swore that one day they would have their revenge on the bloodthirsty Bluecoat. The Black Hills of Wyoming and South Dakota had been ceded as hunting grounds to the Sioux and Cheyenne tribes in 1868. But the situation had changed with the discovery of gold in the hills and the subsequent refusal of the tribes to sell the mineral rights to Washington. Suspecting that the government was about to renege on its agreement, the Indians began to hunt outside the ceded reservations. Washington issued a dire warning that any Indian found in unceded areas after January 31st, 1876 would be considered hostile. The Sioux, the Cheyenne, and the other Indian tribes now joined together to face this common enemy, decided that come what may, they would fight back.
The American government viewed the Indians as a threat within this particular area of the country, due primarily to the protections of citizens, non-Indians, and also the protection of those Indians that were out here that were allies of the United States. is that they wanted to contain the Indian within areas of lands that are called reservations. These are areas of lands much smaller than the Indian had originally had. But within these lands, they were signed within agreement of treaty given to the Indians for as long as the grass shall grow and the water shall flow. But within certain circumstances, that wasn't to happen due to the discovery of gold, due to the prosperity within those lands and the wanting of those lands by non-Indians for settlement.
It was Major General Alfred H. Terry who was entrusted with the task of rounding up the troublesome Indians and returning them to the reservations. It was thought that even with the combined strength of the Indian tribes, they could only muster perhaps 800 warriors. Tragically, events were to prove that estimate to be wildly inaccurate. In fact, it was Major Reno who discovered a very large Indian trail while on a reconnaissance mission to the Little Bighorn River. It was the first warning that the strength of the hostiles had been underestimated. It was also studiously ignored by Terry. Back at Fort Abraham Lincoln, Custer was desperate to get into the action. In a strategy meeting on June 21, 1876, Terry decided that Custer's 7th Cavalry would enter the Rosebud Valley at the southern end of the Little Bighorn and join in a pincer movement with Colonel John Gibbon to the north. In this way, the Indian camp in the Little Bighorn Valley would be blocked in, and escape would be impossible. Terry also gave Custer one other very specific order. He was under no circumstances to use the trail discovered by Reno. He was to enter the valley by the exact route Terry had indicated. This, Terry asserted, was the very best way to achieve the desired result from the attack which would take place on June 26th. On June 22nd, Custer led the 7th Cavalry out of camp for what would prove to be the last time. Dressed flamboyantly in a fringed buckskin jacket, his broad-brimmed hat and bright red bandana, the regiment's theme tune, Gary Owen, was played jauntily by the band as the troops filed past Major General Terry. It was like a scene from the books that had enthralled Custer as a cadet. Now it was his turn to give the Indians a whipping. Later that very day, Custer wrote his last letter to Libby.
My darling, I have but a few moments to write as we start at 12, and I have my hands full of preparations for the scout. Do not be anxious about me. You would be surprised how closely I obey your orders about keeping with the column. I hope to have a good report to send you by the next mail. The success will send us all toward Lincoln. I send you an extract from General Terry's official order to me, knowing how keenly you appreciate words of commendation and confidence in your dear beau. It is, of course, impossible to give you any definite instructions in regard to this movement, and, were it not possible to do so, the department commander places so much confidence in your zeal, energy, and ability to impose on you precise orders which might hamper your action when nearly in contact with the enemy. Your devoted boy, Audie.
Custer now subjected his men to 2 days' grueling marching in almost unbearable heat. During the 23rd and 24th of June, the 7th covered over 80 miles. Another 10 miles were marched during the night of the 25th. As Custer rode at the head of his exhausted men, he took the decision to ignore Terry's specific orders not to use Reno's trail. After all, what had Terry's written order said? The commander places too much confidence in your ability when nearly in contact with the enemy. Well, here was Custer, overlooking the Bighorn Valley and nearly in contact with the enemy. However, at dawn on June 26th, Custer's scouts reported that they had seen Sioux Indians watching the regiment from high ground above the valley. Custer knew that the vital element of surprise had been lost. Common sense, not to say prudent military practice, demanded a rethink of the battle plan. But no, glory beckoned for Custer and the 7th Cavalry, and he had no intention of letting a valley half filled with savages deny him. He determined to attack the village. To compound this fatal misjudgment, Custer committed the cardinal military sin of dividing his forces in sight of the enemy. At last, Custer's luck was about to run out. He ordered Captain Benteen's 3 troops to hold the bluffs to the south, thereby preventing the obvious Indian escape route. Major Reno, with his 3 troops, was to attack the southern end of the village from south of the Little Bighorn River, while Custer, with 5 troops under his personal command, would attack from the hills to the east. It was the hapless Reno who first realized that Custer's decision to attack would be disastrous. As he began his assault to the south, his 112 men were beaten back by hundreds and hundreds of bloodthirsty, screaming Sioux warriors. After a few short minutes, victory was obviously impossible. Only the scale of defeat was in question. Realizing quickly that the only escape route was across the Little Bighorn River, Reno's men fought their way to the riverbank and up the slopes of the bluff to the north, which would later become known as Reno's Hill. Here, the panic-stricken Reno assessed his losses: 3 officers and nearly 50 men killed, wounded, or missing. And still the Indian warriors came. Meanwhile, to the north of the Indian village, Custer, unaware of the disaster occurring to the south, prepared to attack the northern end of the village. Suddenly, and to his horror, the 7th were confronted with a sea of Indian braves commanded by Chief Crazy Horse, firing arrows and shooting their Winchester and Henry repeating rifles with deadly accuracy. Custer's 5 troops, about half of whom were seeing their first action, were overwhelmed by the frenzied Indian attack. There was simply no escape. Custer and his men had no alternative but to withdraw into close order, their numbers dwindling with every minute which passed, and fight to the last man. Sadly, the inexperienced cavalrymen, armed with only single-shot rifles and kneeling or standing to fire, presented unmissable targets. The battleground soon became a nightmare of swirling, choking dust as the hot Wyoming air filled with the screams of terrified horses and wounded men. The Indian braves fought their way onto the top of the hill, killing as they went, and there followed the most appalling carnage. The frenzied battle lasted for 1 hour, and more than 200 troopers died on Last Stand Hill with Custer. Custer himself was killed by 2 bullets, one through the head and one in the breast. Incredibly, his body remained unmutilated by the triumphant Indians, but his unfortunate brother Thomas was subjected to the full horrors of Indian bloodlust. He was found naked, scalped, and with his heart cut out, his body bristling with arrows. Also among the dead and obscenely mutilated were Boston Custer, the young brother of George and Tom, who was traveling with the 7th Cavalry as a civilian guide, and the Custer's brother-in-law, James Calhoun. As silence fell on Last Stand Hill, the only member of the 7th Cavalry left alive was Captain Keogh's horse, Comanche, who stood forlornly over his dead master as the Indians stripped and looted bodies. Although the fighting was finished on Last Stand Hill, the battle for Reno's Hill, 4 miles to the south, was far from over. There, Reno's shocked and terrified troopers had to endure a night without water, hemmed in by the Indians. Meanwhile, in the camp of the Rosebud Valley, the victorious tribes celebrated their great victory. Reno's men must have realized that the bloody scalps being brandished by the dancing braves were those of their slaughtered colleagues at the far end of the valley. When morning finally came, Reno's men had to beat off 2 more fierce assaults before the Indians called a halt to their attacks. General Terry finally arrived in the Bighorn Valley on the morning of June 27th, where he and his men were confronted with the butchered remains of the 7th Cavalry. Within days, the news had reached a disbelieving public. George Armstrong Custer, Civil War hero and frontier fighter, was dead. And so, Custer had made his famous last stand, and amid an orgy of destruction and violence, his name had passed into legend. The Sioux and the Cheyenne had finally wreaked their terrible vengeance on the hated yellow hair. It was to be their greatest victory over the white man. Back at Fort Abraham Lincoln, Libby Custer grieved along with the widows of the men of the 7th Cavalry. She would outlive her husband by 57 years, finally dying in 1933 at the age of 91. She would never remarry. And even in death, Marcus Reno could not escape the specter of Custer. Although he had somehow survived the horrors of the Little Bighorn, he was slowly destroyed by a vicious campaign of insinuation and innuendo, instigated by the pro-Custer faction in the 7th Cavalry. Had Reno not retreated, the whisper said, the battle could have been won, and Custer would still be alive. Although it was never proved, Reno was forever tainted by the insinuation of cowardice. He eventually degenerated into a drunken brawler, was dismissed from the Army, and died a pauper in 1889. The Little Bighorn had claimed its last victim. George Armstrong Custer was a hero in the purest sense. Dashing, handsome, and brave as a lion, but he was without doubt a limited soldier. So many of his great victories were won by instinct and courage, aided of course by the magic of Custer's luck. Eventually, his disregard of military convention and his refusal to obey orders were to cost him his life. The tragedy of his terrible death has somehow overshadowed a truly remarkable life, but it has ensured that the legend of Yellow Hair will live on forevermore.